The theater was packed that evening, buzzing with excitement. The audience had high expectations as they settled into their seats, eagerly waiting for the performance to begin. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, the kind you get before a big event, and whispers about the show's headliner filled the room. People were ready for a memorable night, expecting an unforgettable performance from an experienced, professional artist. As the lights dimmed, the crowd grew quieter, but there was still a sense of excitement. The stage was set with a grand piano gleaming under the soft spotlight. The stage manager gave one final nod, and the curtain began to rise. At first, the audience couldn't see much, just a silhouette of someone walking toward the piano. There was a brief moment of silence, followed by a quiet gasp from a few in the front row. Then, as the figure moved closer into the light, it became clear. A young woman was making her way to the piano. She looked out of place. Her outfit was simple, almost too casual for the event. She wasn't dressed in the usual glamorous attire that performers usually wore at such events. She seemed almost nervous, hesitant, as though she wasn't entirely sure of herself. She had a slight slouch in her posture, and her face held an expression that reflected uncertainty, not the confident look you'd expect from someone who had come to perform in front of such a crowd. Some in the audience started to murmur to each other. There were a few polite chuckles, followed by whispers of confusion. "Who is she?" someone asked. "Is she a last-minute replacement?" Another whispered. It was clear that people weren't sure why she was there, and their skepticism was obvious. Her appearance didn't match their expectations for a performer in such an important setting. As she sat down at the piano, her hands trembling just slightly as she adjusted her seat, the whispers grew louder. Some laughed under their breath, clearly doubting her ability. They didn't think she looked like someone capable of delivering anything worth remembering. They expected an experienced artist, someone who had rehearsed for months, not a young woman who appeared to be new to the spotlight. It wasn't malicious, just a reflection of their surprise and lack of confidence in her. The woman took a deep breath, almost as if preparing herself for something bigger than the moment. She placed her fingers gently on the keys, hesitating for just a second before she began. The sound that filled the room was soft, delicate, a far cry from the loud, energetic performances the audience had been expecting. It was clear from the very first note that this wasn't going to be a typical performance. It wasn't polished and it wasn't perfectly rehearsed, but it was sincere. A few moments passed and the crowd's reaction shifted. The laughter died down a little, but the skepticism remained. People were still unsure about what was happening. The music she played was simple, nothing extraordinary. It was just a few gentle notes like someone finding their way, unsure of the path ahead. But there was something about the way she played. It wasn't just about the notes or the music. It was about the raw emotion behind each sound. Some in the audience began to listen more closely. Her playing wasn't perfect, but there was an authenticity to it that started to draw them in. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, and she certainly wasn't trying to follow any traditional rules of performance. It felt like she was just playing from the heart, expressing something deep inside her that she couldn't put into words. The crowd's initial doubt started to fade, though the room was still filled with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. As the melody continued, the young woman seemed to grow more comfortable. Her hands moved across the keys with a little more confidence, the music slowly becoming more complex. There was a subtle change in the tone, something that could only be described as the beginning of a transformation. The audience, though still uncertain, could feel something shifting. What had started as nervous, hesitant notes was turning into something far more profound. By now, a few people had stopped chatting and were watching closely, their eyes fixed on her. The initial judgment that she didn't belong here was beginning to melt away. But it wasn't just the music that had started to change, it was her presence. As she played, she seemed to forget about the audience completely. It was as if the room had faded away and there was only the piano, her hands and the emotion flowing through her fingertips. She wasn't performing anymore. She was connecting with something deeper. Her playing became more fluid, more confident, as if she was shedding the doubts and fears that had initially weighed her down. The crowd, though still skeptical, couldn't help but notice. The soft, simple notes had now transformed into a melody that felt rich, full of heart. It wasn't perfect in the traditional sense. There were still moments where the melody stumbled or faltered, but there was a beauty in that imperfection. It wasn't about playing the right notes. It was about expressing something that words couldn't convey. The tension in the room slowly shifted from disbelief to something else, something more hopeful. The audience, who had once laughed at her entrance, now watched in complete silence. There was no more mockery, no more whispers. They were just listening, waiting to understand what was unfolding in front of them. What started as skepticism was now transforming into quiet admiration. Some people began to feel a stirring in their hearts. They weren't sure exactly why, but the music spoke to them. Maybe it reminded them of something they had forgotten, something deep inside them that had been buried under the pressures of everyday life. For a few, it was a feeling of nostalgia. For others, it was a sense of recognition. They knew that this young woman, despite the initial laughter and mockery, was giving them something genuine, something real. There was still a long way to go, but the audience had stopped thinking about who she was or where she came from. They had stopped worrying about her appearance or her lack of experience. They were no longer focused on the idea that she didn't belong here. Instead, they were listening, feeling, and witnessing something special, something raw and human. The young woman didn't notice the shift in the room, nor did she care. She was too absorbed in her music, too lost in the emotions she was expressing. With every note, she seemed to release a little more of herself. The music, simple as it was, began to take on a life of its own. It became a story, a journey that the audience could feel as much as they could hear. They were no longer spectators. They were participants in the unfolding moment. The initial laughter had died away. The crowd, once so full of doubt, was now waiting, holding their breath. What would happen next? What more could she reveal? And most importantly, how much further could her music carry them? As the music continued to play, the mood in the room slowly shifted. The initial uncertainty had begun to fade, replaced by something quieter, more respectful. The young woman at the piano was no longer just a performer. She had become part of the space, part of the moment, and the audience was starting to see her not as an outsider, but as someone with something important to say. The simplicity of her music, which had once seemed like an error, now felt like a gift, a chance to listen to something real. Her fingers moved more confidently now, each note flowing with more ease than before. The music that had once been hesitant was now gaining momentum, building into something more powerful, more certain. Each key pressed seemed to carry more weight, as though each note had a purpose. It wasn't just a performance, it was a conversation, a quiet exchange between her and the crowd. The audience, still uncertain but now more focused, started to feel a connection to the music. They weren't just hearing it, they were feeling it. There was a tenderness to the melody that wrapped itself around the room like a warm blanket, pulling them in. The laughter that had once filled the air had been replaced with a quiet stillness, and the murmurs of doubt had disappeared. No one dared to interrupt the flow of the music now. It had its own life, its own rhythm, and the audience was at its mercy. With every passing moment, the young woman seemed to lose herself a little more in the music. Her posture, which had initially been tense and unsure, began to relax. She started to lean into the piano, her body moving gently with the flow of the melody. The more she played, the more she seemed to forget the audience altogether. It was as if she had stepped into a world of her own, a world where the music was the only thing that mattered. For some in the crowd, this was a revelation. They had come to the theater expecting to see a polished performance, a show filled with perfect technique and grand gestures. But what they were witnessing was something different, a quiet, intimate experience that was more about vulnerability than perfection. It was as though they had stumbled upon a secret, something they hadn't expected to find in such a public place. A few people in the audience exchanged glances, slowly realizing that the young woman was not here to impress them with her technical skill. Instead, she was offering something deeper, her emotions, her thoughts, and her soul all laid bare through her music. She wasn't trying to be perfect, and that was the beauty of it. There was something deeply human in her playing, something that spoke directly to the heart. The sound of the piano now filled the entire theater, each note ringing out clear and true, as though it were carrying a message meant for everyone in the room. The young woman's hands glided over the keys with increasing confidence, and though the music was still soft, it had a strength to it now, a quiet power that couldn't be ignored. It was as if the simple melody was telling a story of struggle, of hope, and of triumph. In the audience, there were those who had initially laughed at her entrance, those who had thought she didn't belong in this setting. Now, As the music washed over them, they began to understand that their laughter had been misplaced. The young woman at the piano was not someone to be laughed at. She was someone to be listened to. And as they listened, they realized that they had been wrong to judge her before she had even started. The quiet power of her performance was beginning to break down the walls in the room. The audience, which had once been so quick to judge, was now opening itself to the experience. People who had been skeptical just moments ago were now leaning forward, hanging on to every note. The young woman's music had drawn them in, and they couldn't help but listen more closely, feeling every chord, every phrase, with a depth they hadn't expected. Some of the people in the audience began to close their eyes, allowing the music to take them somewhere else. For some, it brought back memories of times long past, memories of childhood, of lost loves, of dreams once held close and now faded away. For others, the music seemed to speak to something in their present, something they had been holding on to but hadn't fully understood. It was as if the piano was unlocking something inside them, a door to emotions they hadn't known they were carrying. The young woman at the piano, though unaware of the effect she was having, continued to play. Her eyes were closed now, her face serene as she lost herself in the music. It was as if she had found a language that transcended words, a way to speak without saying anything at all. The music was her voice, and it was speaking louder than anything she could have said with her words. The audience, once so distracted by their own doubts, now found themselves completely absorbed in the performance. There were no more whispers, no more laughter, no more skepticism. There was only the music and the young woman who was pouring her heart into every note. And slowly the atmosphere in the room shifted from one of judgment to one of awe. As the music began to grow in complexity, so did the emotions it stirred in the audience. The notes, once simple and cautious, were now flowing with an energy that was impossible to ignore. There was a rhythm to it now, a momentum that carried the listener along with it. It wasn't just the technical skill of the young woman that impressed the crowd. It was the depth of emotion she conveyed with each stroke of the keys. For the first time, the audience felt as though they were part of something bigger than themselves. It wasn't just about the performance anymore. It was about connection. The young woman's music was reaching into their hearts, making them feel something deeper than they had expected. And as they listened, they realized that this was the magic of live performance, the ability to make someone feel seen, heard and understood without ever saying a word. The young woman continued to play, her hands moving across the keys with a fluidity that was almost hypnotic. The music built to a gentle crescendo, its melody now filled with a sense of resolve, a sense that something important had been achieved. The audience was no longer passive spectators. They had become active participants in the experience. They were moved, and they couldn't help but feel the weight of the emotions in the music. As the final note hung in the air, the room was silent. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as though time had slowed down, and all that existed was the lingering sound of the last chord. The young woman sat at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys, her breath slow and steady. She opened her eyes, looking out at the audience, unsure of what to expect. She had no idea how her performance had been received. She had been too lost in the music to pay attention to the crowd. But when she looked up, she was met with a sight that took her by surprise. The entire audience was silent, their eyes fixed on her, as if they had been waiting for something. And then, slowly, one by one, the audience began to applaud. It wasn't the polite applause that follows an ordinary performance. It was something deeper, more genuine. People were clapping because they had been moved, because they had witnessed something real. The young woman smiled softly, her heart racing, as she took in the response. The laughter that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by something more powerful: respect, admiration, and a deep, quiet connection. As the applause slowly faded, the young woman sat at the piano, still processing what had just happened. She had been so immersed in the music, so lost in the moment, that she hadn't noticed the shift in the room. The energy had changed completely. What started as nervousness, doubt, and skepticism had transformed into something far deeper. The crowd was no longer just a group of people waiting to be entertained. They had become witnesses to something profoundly human. They had experienced a journey, a quiet, emotional journey alongside her. The young woman slowly lifted her hands from the keys, looking out at the audience with a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. She wasn't sure if she had done something right or if the music had just connected with people in a way she hadn't expected. But the looks on their faces, eyes wide, some even teary-eyed, told her all she needed to know. She had touched something deep inside them, something they didn't expect to feel during a performance like this. They hadn't just heard music. They had experienced something real, something raw. For the first time, she felt like the piano was not just an instrument. It had become an extension of herself. It was as though the keys were her voice, the notes her words. She had always played to express herself, but tonight it felt different. The music had come from a place inside her that she hadn't even realized was there. It wasn't about hitting the right notes or performing flawlessly. It was about conveying something true, something unspoken. As she stood up from the piano, the applause grew louder, almost overwhelming. The audience was not just clapping for a good performance. They were clapping for the connection they had felt, for the moment of vulnerability and beauty she had shared with them. She could see people standing, wiping their eyes, and even a few in the front row nodding in quiet understanding. The young woman's heart swelled, but it was a different feeling from the nervousness she had felt earlier. It was a mixture of relief and gratitude. She had come to the stage uncertain, but now she felt something she had never experienced before: acceptance. She looked around the theater, seeing the faces of people who had once doubted her, but now seemed to understand her in a way she hadn't imagined. They weren't just applauding her skill, they were applauding the courage it took for her to stand in front of them and share her truth. For so long she had kept her emotions locked away, afraid to let them out, but through her music she had finally found a way to release them, and the audience had felt that release too. The woman took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The applause was beginning to quiet down, but she didn't know what to do next. She wasn't used to this level of attention. She had always been someone who shied away from the spotlight, someone who preferred to stay in the background. But now she was standing in the center of it, with the entire room focused on her. For a moment, she thought about leaving, walking off the stage and disappearing into the shadows where she could once again be anonymous. But something held her in place. Something told her that this moment, this experience, wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had been there to witness it. She had shared her story through music, and now she needed to listen to theirs. She stepped back to the piano, but instead of sitting down, she stood beside it, looking out at the audience. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt empowering. She wasn't the same person who had walked onto that stage a short while ago. The doubts, the insecurities, the fears, they had all melted away with the music. She was no longer just a young woman uncertain of her place. She was someone who had found her voice. A few people in the audience stood up, their faces full of admiration and respect. One by one, others joined in, until the entire room was on its feet, applauding her not just for the performance, but for the courage it took to share such a personal piece of herself. The sound of clapping filled the theater, and for the first time, the young woman felt like she belonged here. She wasn't just a performer. She was part of something larger than herself. She had connected with the audience in a way she hadn't thought possible. As the applause continued, she felt a strange mixture of emotions. She was proud of herself, yes, but there was also a sense of vulnerability. She had exposed her innermost thoughts and feelings, and now she was open to whatever came next. But the more she stood there, the more she realized that it didn't matter what happened next. What mattered was that she had been true to herself in that moment. And that was enough. The lights in the theater brightened, and the audience began to settle back into their seats. The young woman, still standing beside the piano, finally allowed herself to breathe. She smiled, a small but genuine smile, and nodded in thanks to the crowd. Her heart was still racing, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from the realization that she had done something she hadn't thought possible. She had not only found her voice, but she had shared it with others, and they had heard her. After a few moments, the audience began to file out of the theater. Some stopped to congratulate her. Others simply smiled and nodded. But no one seemed to be in a hurry to leave. The energy in the room was still palpable, still charged with the emotions the music had stirred up. People had come expecting one thing, a typical performance, and had left with something far greater. A sense of connection, a shared experience of vulnerability and beauty. As the last few people exited, the young woman remained by the piano looking out at the empty seats. The room, which had once been filled with doubt and uncertainty, was now filled with something else, something that couldn't be described by words alone. She felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in a long time, she was at peace with herself. She had let go of the fear, the insecurity, and the judgment, and in return, she had found a new sense of purpose. It wasn't about being perfect or flawless. It was about being human, and in that moment, she had allowed herself to be fully human, to feel, to express, and to share. And that, she realized, was the most powerful thing she could ever do. The young woman stood beside the piano, still processing what had just happened. The applause had faded and the theater was slowly emptying out, but she remained rooted to the spot, staring at the empty seats, feeling a mixture of disbelief and peace. She had been so nervous just hours before, unsure if she belonged there, unsure if anyone would even care about what she had to say through her music. Now everything had changed. She had shared a piece of herself, and the audience had not only heard it, they had felt it. She took a deep breath and slowly walked off the stage, her footsteps echoing through the now quiet theater. Backstage, she found a corner to sit down, her mind still racing. She wasn't sure what she was feeling, but it was a strange mix of relief, gratitude, and awe. She had never expected her performance to have such an impact. For so long, she had kept her emotions to herself, unsure of how to express them. But tonight, the music had spoken for her. As she sat there, reflecting on the experience, she thought about the way the audience had reacted. They had started out unsure of her, laughing at her entrance and questioning why she was there. But by the end of the performance, they had embraced her completely. The connection she had felt with them had been real. She had shared something vulnerable and they had responded with open hearts. It was a moment she would never forget. She couldn't help but think about the music itself. It had been so simple at first, so tentative, but as she continued to play, something had shifted within her. The music had become a way for her to communicate, a language that didn't require words. It had allowed her to express everything she had been holding inside, the doubts, the fears, the hopes, and the dreams. And through that expression, she had found a way to connect with others. It was more than just a performance, it was a shared experience, a mutual understanding that transcended the boundaries of the stage and the audience. The young woman smiled softly as she stood up, stretching her arms above her head. She felt a sense of release, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had never imagined that one performance could change so much. She had come to the theater that evening with no expectations, unsure of what would happen, but now she realized that the experience had transformed her. She had come into her own, found her voice, and shared it with the world. As she walked toward the exit, she passed by the theater's front doors. A few people were still lingering outside, chatting and laughing about the show. Some of them looked up as she passed, offering her a friendly smile or a word of congratulations. She smiled back, but it wasn't the same kind of smile she had given them earlier. It was different now. There was a quiet confidence in it, a knowing that she had done something real, something meaningful. When she stepped out into the cool night air, she took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of freedom. The night felt different now, as if the world had shifted just a little. She wasn't sure where she was going next, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She had stepped out of her comfort zone, put herself out there in a way she hadn't done before, and it had worked. The performance, the music, the connection with the audience. It had all come together in a way that felt magical. But even more than that, she had learned something important about herself. For so long, she had hidden behind her fears and insecurities, convinced that she wasn't good enough to share her music with the world. She had been afraid of judgment, afraid of failure. But tonight she had done it. She had taken that leap of faith, and the world hadn't come crashing down around her. Instead, it had embraced her, just as the audience had embraced her performance. The young woman smiled as she walked down the quiet street, the sound of her footsteps mixing with the faint hum of the city around her. She didn't have all the answers, but she didn't need them. She knew that she had found something inside herself that she had been searching for. It wasn't fame or approval. It was the simple truth of being human. She had allowed herself to be vulnerable, and in doing so, she had found strength. As she walked, she thought about what would come next. Would she continue to perform? Would she find a way to make music her life? She didn't know yet. But for the first time, she felt open to whatever the future held. She knew that she couldn't stay where she was forever. She had to keep moving forward, keep growing, and keep sharing her music with the world. She couldn't keep hiding behind the fear of judgment anymore. There was too much beauty in the world, too much potential, and she was ready to embrace it all. The young woman stopped at a small cafe on the corner, a place she often passed but rarely entered. Tonight it seemed like the perfect place to pause and reflect. She walked inside and ordered a cup of tea, settling into a cozy corner by the window. The soft light of the street lamps outside illuminated the room, casting a peaceful glow over everything. She took a sip of her tea and closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the cup fill her. She thought about the people who had watched her perform, the ones who had initially laughed and doubted her. They had seen her at her most vulnerable, and yet instead of dismissing her, they had embraced her. The realization struck her with a quiet force. Vulnerability was not something to be ashamed of. It was something to be celebrated. It was a way to connect with others, to show that we are all human with our flaws, our fears, and our strengths. She had found that connection, and it had changed everything. As she sat there reflecting on the night, a sense of peace washed over her. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to know exactly what the future held. She just had to keep playing, keep creating, and keep sharing. The rest would come in time. And for the first time, she was okay with that. Whatever came next, she knew she would be ready for it. She had already taken the hardest step, the step to be true to herself, to share her music, and to connect with others in a way that was real and raw. That was enough. The future didn't seem so uncertain anymore. Whatever came, she was ready to face it, one note at a time. The days after the performance seemed to move in a blur for the young woman. She had stepped out of her comfort zone in a way that she had never imagined possible. The night she had played at the theater was still fresh in her mind, and each time she thought about it, she felt a sense of calm, mixed with pride. It had been more than just a performance. It had been a revelation, not just for the audience, but for herself. At first, she wasn't sure what to expect in the days that followed. Would she go back to her old life feeling the same uncertainty and fear she had before, or would she continue to carry the confidence that had unexpectedly come from opening up to the world? She had expected life to return to normal, but instead she found herself thinking more deeply about the music. Each note, each chord had felt like a part of her soul spilling out for the world to hear. It was as if the music had unlocked something she didn't know was there. She had been afraid for so long, afraid of judgment, afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of failing. But in that moment, in front of that audience, all of those fears had fallen away. The experience had opened her eyes to the idea that the most powerful thing she could do was simply to be herself. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't go back to hiding. There was something in her, something that music had allowed her to express, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. The young woman had always known that music was her passion, but that night she had discovered how deeply it resonated with her heart. It wasn't just about playing the piano. It was about expressing the emotions she had kept buried inside for so long. Music had become her language, her way of communicating with the world in a way that felt true to herself. Her days after the performance weren't without their challenges, though. There were moments when she would doubt herself again, moments when the fear crept back in. Was it really possible for her to continue sharing her music? Would people want to hear more of what she had to say? But whenever the doubt arose, she would think back to that night. The look in the eyes of the audience, their faces reflecting a shared understanding, a connection that transcended anything she had imagined. It was that memory that gave her strength. She had stepped into the unknown, and it had changed her. There was no going back now. It wasn't long before she started looking for more opportunities to perform. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. There would be other moments of doubt, other times when the fear of judgment would try to creep back in. But she also knew that she couldn't let that stop her. There was something in her, a voice that had been waiting to be heard, and she wasn't about to silence it again. She began playing at smaller venues, cafes, open mics, local events, anything that would give her a chance to share her music. The first few performances after the theater were nerve-wracking. She would stand at the piano, her heart racing, wondering if anyone would listen, if anyone would care. But each time as she started to play, something beautiful happened. The audience would quiet, and she would feel that connection again. The same sense of vulnerability, the same quiet understanding. It wasn't about perfection. It was about being real, being present, and allowing the music to speak for itself. There were nights when she still doubted herself. There were times when she questioned whether anyone truly understood what she was trying to express. But then she would see the way people responded to her music, The smiles, the tears, the quiet moments of reflection, and she would know that she was on the right path. She wasn't just playing for herself. She was playing for everyone who needed to hear what she had to say. Over time, she started to notice changes in herself. She became more confident, more sure of who she was and what she wanted to do. She began to trust herself and her ability to connect with others through her music. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to fit into anyone's mold. All she needed to do was be true to herself, and the rest would follow. The more she played, the more she realized how much she had grown. She had gone from a young woman who was afraid to even step onto the stage to someone who now embraced the power of vulnerability and connection. Each performance was a step forward, a moment to reaffirm that she was on the right path. There were still moments of fear, but they didn't control her anymore. They became a part of the process, a reminder that growth and change didn't come without challenges. One evening, after a particularly moving performance at a small local cafe, a woman approached her. She was older with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said. "Your music really spoke to me. It made me feel like I wasn't alone in what I was going through." The young woman felt her heart swell at the words. "I'm so glad it resonated with you," she said, her voice a little shaky. The woman smiled again. "You know, sometimes we forget how much power there is in music. It can heal, it can connect, it can make us feel things we didn't even know we were feeling." The young woman nodded, feeling that same connection, the one that had been there that night at the theater. "It's funny," she said. "I didn't realize how much I needed to share my music until I did." The woman chuckled softly. "Well, you're doing a beautiful thing. Keep going. There are people who need to hear it." As the woman walked away, the young woman stood there, her heart full. She had never expected to have such an impact on anyone. When she had first started, it had all been about her. Her fear, her uncertainty, her desire to prove something. But now it was about something bigger. It was about connection. She realized that her music wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who needed to hear it, for everyone who was looking for a way to connect, to feel understood. That night, as she sat in the quiet of her room, she thought about how far she had come. She remembered the young woman who had walked onto the stage with shaky hands, unsure of what the future held. She remembered the laughter, the doubt, the fear, and she realized how much she had changed since then. The music had been her gateway, her path to self-discovery. It had shown her the power of vulnerability and the beauty of sharing what was inside. The future was still uncertain. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt. But now she faced them with a different perspective. She didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to be perfect. All she needed to do was keep playing, keep sharing, and keep being true to herself. She smiled as she picked up her piano sheet music, ready to play again. The journey was just beginning, and she couldn't wait to see where it would take her. She knew one thing for sure. No matter what came next, she was no longer afraid to step onto the stage. She had already found her voice, and now it was time to let it be heard.